Welcome to Season 2 of FinTech's a podcast by the one and only policy shop for Canada's fintech scene. I'm Alex, and I'll be your host. Join me as I talk to the people who are making a big difference in the lives of Canadians. Today, our guest is Brigit Carroll. She leads North American policy for Wise. In this episode, we talk about two things that apparently go together: junk fees and cross-border payments. Brigit, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
First question, big one, at least for me. I've heard the term used a lot, but I'm not 100% sure what it means. What is a junk fee?
I think we've all heard about junk fees, and to your point, it can mean a lot of things. I think essentially a junk fee is when you pay for something, like a good or a service, but then you don't have transparent disclosure. You don't fully understand what you're paying, and then you're surprised afterward by extra or hidden fees tacked on. And importantly, tacked on for no additional value or service, right? So I think that's really what makes something a junk fee. We see this across so many industries. We've seen airlines, drip pricing, and sort of retail or online hidden fees. But we also see it in financial services, and Canadians are really feeling the pinch.
Is it so I feel like there are a few things going on here. There's like the unbundling of the fees, like rather than just being like, here's
Right.
the one price. It's like, no, this is part of the price, and then later on you're going to get some of the other prices. Is it the unbundling that's bad? You mentioned transparency. Is it the lack of transparency? What exactly is the evil here?
Yeah, I think so. It's not necessarily unbundling that's the problem. I think the problem is when you're a consumer and you're going to shop around for a product or a service, you want to be able to compare apples to apples. And so when some fees are basically obscured, you can't do that. And so that's essentially a market failure. And it means consumers can't find the cheapest option, keeps prices artificially high. And so it really comes down to like a regular person trying to shop for something is not able to find the total cost of that. That's a problem. That's what keeps prices high. And we see that across financial services, but especially in like international transfers and cross-border payments.
So it's not so much that the price is unbundled into a number of different prices. It's more that some of those prices that have been unbundled are obscure. Can you give me like a concrete example of like the way in which a company might obscure the price? Like, I use Uber Eats a lot, way more than I should. But it always
Same
bothers me
here.
when like, yeah, I'm putting things into my cart, I'm ready to check out. I think the price is a certain way. And then when I look at the price at the end, there are all these additional fees, and it's like, 20% more expensive than I kind of thought it would be.
No.
Because I have no willpower, I proceed with the order anyways. But is that what you're getting at, or is it different than that?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. We see this, I travel a lot as well. And you can see this, for example, in the travel industry where previously, you have how much it is to pay for a hotel per night. And now we're seeing increasingly that fees are sort of being brought to the end of like afterwards. So after your stay, I've had this where you're checking out, you think you've paid everything, and then there's going to be additional fees tacked on. Those fees are okay as long as they're being made clear to the consumer. And this is sort of what we see in the cross-border payment space. So, you're sending money to family and friends abroad, for example, from Canada. You look online, you see sort of low or no fees. You say, okay, that seems like a pretty good deal. But then once your money arrives on the other side, you only then do you realize I actually got less than what I thought I was paying for. And that surprise element is the part that really rubs people in the wrong way and is sort of what makes it a junk fee. We see that, across Canada, the number of people sending money cross-border is going up. And so, when junk fees are a big part of cross-border payments, that's going to affect more and more Canadians, especially during sort of a cost of living and affordability crisis. So there's still limited research into sort of how Canadian consumers like perceive junk fees. So I think it's interesting to get into how they're perceived, how they're affecting people's financial well-being, how it's affecting people's behavior when it comes to shopping for goods and services, etc. So yeah, we've actually commissioned a study looking at this in a little bit more detail.
I really want to dig into the detail of all the fees associated with moving money across borders, as well as your report. But before we get there, I just want to poke at the concept of a junk fee a bit more,
Yeah.
just so I, and I mean maybe any listeners who are as curious as I am, understand it. Are are there cases where these mandatory fees being tacked on after the fact are being charged to a subset of consumers who are actually just being charged to cover a cost that they are uniquely generating for the provider? For example, late payment fees on a credit card, or baggage fees when you're booking a
Mhm.
ticket with an airline. These are mandatory if you want to pay your bill later, bring bags with you while you're traveling. But again, you're kind of imposing a cost on the provider, and that fee after the fact can be understood as a way to just um, uh, um, uh, collect the costs of doing that or providing that to your customer.
Right. Yeah, I think that's where you get into a gray area, right? So ideally, like for a baggage fee, it's a good example. Do Is that a junk fee? I'm not sure. Um, Ideally, you know how much that fee will be before you get to the airport. And I think that's, again, what we've seen over the years. In the past, there was none of these fees they were always built into the price. And now it's more of these tacked on. But, still, when you get to the airport, you're paying at the point of when you're checking the baggage. It's not after the fact, it's not hidden in that case. So there is a little bit of gray area to your point. I think the difference is where you're paying for an additional service. So to your point, like it's something physical that you're bringing, you're paying for that versus you think you're paying for the total cost, for example, for a financial service to send a payment and then you're not realizing that you're actually paying more in a hidden exchange rate. That's not for an additional service or value add. That's for the actual service you were paying for up front.
So the government announced its crackdown on junk fees a while ago. As part of this, it's focusing on NSF fees. And as part of its crackdown on NSF fees, which I mean, presumably are junky, the federal government is proposing to cap them. But given everything we just said at the outset, given that kind of abstract definition we tried to establish, are NSF fees actually junk fees?
So this was an interesting one that it was the first that the government sort of decided to tackle in the junk fee space. I mean, I think we've probably all been there. You don't realize you don't have enough money in your account. You accidentally go over. But then that can very quickly evolve into a tricky situation where then you see financial providers sort of tacking on exponentially higher fees at every point. And I think that's where it becomes really harmful to the consumer. And so I'm not sort of surprised that the government decided to tackle this first. I think it's something that a lot of people have faced. Um, I think to the point where it's becoming really egregious in terms of the amount that you're charging is where it becomes really junky, like to your point. Um, what we haven't seen is the government taking action in a broader way on junk fees and financial services. Like they've only captured this so far, and that was last fall. So I think there's room for the government to take a broader view on like junk fees in financial services, financial products. Um, I have some ideas on what that could be, but I'll stop there.
I almost kind of read into the government's action here, or steps it's proposing it takes, as like this acknowledgement that NSF fees aren't exactly junky. Because if they were totally junk fees, I have to imagine the government would try to do more than just cap them.
Right.
The fact that they're only capping them to me suggests that they recognize that the NSF fee reflects some real cost that is being incurred by FIs as a result of the actions of their account holders.
Hmm.
And so they don't want to say they should be zero. Um, I don't think they're doing anything around transparency either. So, when I saw this, I just kind of thought this might not actually be a junk fee, but we're calling it a junk fee. But real junk fees, cross-border payment space, I know you have a lot of views there, and you guys released that report not too long ago. Before we dive into those, just to kind of level set a bit, what are all the costs a consumer incurs when they're sending money across a border?
So when you use a kind of traditional correspondent, bank to send money cross borders, the reason why cross border payments become so expensive and slow is because you're basically hitting a bunch of different intermediaries along the way. Of course, as a consumer, you're not really seeing this, right? But you're going to send to your Canadian bank, which might have a partnership with another bank, which might have a partnership with another bank, and you're sort of tacking on time and fees at every point. And so just like we don't see that, right, when you're sending it, but that's why it gets so expensive. You usually have, you can have also like pay-in fees, SWIFT fees. It really depends on like the currency route, how you're paying in and out to that payment. But traditionally, that's why it's pretty expensive. So around an average of 6% of the transaction value. At Wise, what we've done is basically built a global infrastructure to enable cheaper, faster cross-border payments. The simplest way of explaining it is Wise has a bank account in one country. We have a bank account in another country. You pay into Wise, and we sort of net that balance cross-border with a complex treasury team globally. So it's sort of that closed loop system as much as possible. That's what makes it, faster and cheaper. If you think about it, like sending an email, right? Like cross-border payments could evolve toward that, where the price is nominal and it's instant. But it's about basically making infrastructure fixes like we've done in order to do that utilizing technology. And so our average fee is like 0.67% of the total transaction cost, significantly lower. And you're gonna, usually when you send money cross border, that fee is on the sending side. So often when we talk about these junk fees or hidden fees, it's when the sender is going to send money cross border that they're gonna be paying that fee.
In this complex chain of operations, who is charging the junk fee, and why isn't it being adequately disclosed to the customer?
Yeah, so it's usually the sending financial provider, right? So that might be your traditional bank, that might be a payments provider, but it's usually where you're starting. And so typically you're presented with sort of low, or I'll put in quotation marks, no transaction fee, but then there's often an inflated exchange rate that you're given. So unless you go on Google and then have your calculator out, which is pretty complicated math, by the way, if you've ever tried to do it, I do it all the time. You won't actually understand like how much you're losing to that margin. And we actually saw a recent consumer survey by Payments Canada that showed that extra or hidden fees present the most significant pain point for sending money internationally for Canadians. So um, that's a pretty major, I think, validation for what we're talking about. And the study that we just commissioned actually showed that most Canadians consider a hidden fee in an international money transfer to be a junk fee.
Tell us more about that report.
Yeah, so we surveyed 2,500 Canadians sort of about their behavior, their perception around junk fees, but specifically in financial services and then cross border payments. And so a few top lines, some really interesting things came out of that. So, for example, 81% of Canadians agree that an unexpected fee incurred by either themselves or the recipient, so the person that you're sending to, when sending money internationally, would have a moderate to large impact on them, negative impact, I should say. And they also found that 79% of Canadians want policymakers to prioritize junk fees legislation to include more financial transactions. So seeing what's happened with the NSF fees, saying, actually, we'd love to see more action in this space.
Do we have a sense of the amount of fees that Canadians pay in the aggregate to move money across borders, or is this very hard to pinpoint?
We commissioned a research study a few years ago that found that Canadians were actually losing billions in this space from sort of inflated, marked up exchange rates. We're working to actually update that number with new research, and I'll definitely tell you once we have it. But I think what we see, like the World Bank is actually the best resource for stats on this, but it's still incomplete. So what we see largely is about a 6% transaction rate, but that, again, does not capture the entire market.
Are there subsets of the Canadian population that are disproportionately affected by uh, cross-border payment junk fees?
So I'd say when we look at who's using cross-border payments, there's a broad swath of different groups. So of course, new Canadians, and we see, increasing numbers on that front, who send money, for example, to India, the Philippines, and other regions. Um, but it's not limited to that. It's also small businesses. And I think this is one that often gets forgotten, right? So you're a small business in a trading economy, you're looking to sell or to pay a vendor in the US, in Asia, what have you. Um, International payments are often very confusing to understand for those small businesses, but the fees are actually a really big problem because think about it, you're paying a vendor in another currency. If what you've paid is not exactly to the cent correct, it can mess up your entire accounting, and your relationship with the vendor. So there's a really practical point here on like SMBs and the pain points for them. But having that transparency on when the payment lands, but also exactly how much is going to get to the other side is actually really crucial. It can actually be a blocker to Canadian SMBs who are trying to expand on the global stage. So I think this is one that just gets like overlooked as a pain point for them. But there's also, Canadians studying abroad, living abroad, working abroad, or, living abroad and then needing to pay loans back home, things like that. So there's so many different people sort of using cross-border payments. Um, and what we see is that even though this kind of cohort has evolved and the need for cross-border payments has increased, we haven't seen, I think, that much evolution in terms of meeting their needs. Like we've seen, innovation on the domestic side of payments in a lot of ways, but for the cross-border, we're just not there yet.
For someone sending money back home, say back home is a poor place where people are getting by on a lot less. 6% of a transaction might not feel like a lot if you're making a lot of money, but to the receiving party, it strikes me that 6% can actually be huge. Like, let's think about
Oh,
places
yeah.
that live on like maybe a few dollars a day. 6% on a $50 transaction is enormous, right? Like when we think
Oh, yeah.
about the economic welfare implications of who loses the most because of how this system works today, is it those people I'm describing?
So, and that's a really interesting question. To your point, yes, it makes a huge impact. That's why one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 includes a goal to reduce the cost of remittances to less than 3% on average by 2030. Um, Spoiler alert, we're not there yet, unfortunately. So, this is like a global commitment. It has a huge impact. What we see is that remittances actually have are larger than foreign direct investment in terms of, these kind of lower income countries now, has a huge impact. And often remittances are used for essential, whether that's food, education, healthcare. This is not for just, extras. The payments that are being sent are absolute lifelines for those communities and those countries. On the other side, when Canadians who are sending money cross border are able to keep more money in their own pockets as well, that has a big impact, especially in the current context where every dollar counts, right?
Given that in some cases, this could quite literally be the difference between, say, life or death. You tell me if that's an exaggeration. Uh,
No, I don't think it is.
Given that's the case, why are people inflating markups? What's going on? Why are they doing that? Are they just like, profit hungry sociopaths? Are they compensating themselves for costs they're incurring and executing this very complex operation? What's going on there?
Look, I think, to be honest, in the past, it's just been like an easy way to continue to charge consumers. Um, I think that there's going to be more and more pressure on sort of traditional financial service providers and others who are obscuring fees as consumers wake up to transparency and understanding more about fees. So, for example, just to give you a Canadian example, with EQ Bank, we work with them and power their cross border payments. Every partner that we work with at Wise also has to offer that transparency to their customers. And interestingly, what we also see is that there's actually a business case for financial providers to do this because one, it basically increases customer trust and referral because what's worse than finding out that what you thought you paid, you actually got less than what you thought. But secondly, we also see that banks that actually adopt this transparency are seeing an increase in volume, more retention, things like this, where consumers are delighted when they realize that you're actually telling them everything that you're going to charge them and that there's no surprises. And what we see, I mean, after 13 years building a Wise, is this is really powerful. Like it makes consumers sort of evangelical about loving this transparency in this product. And I think that others across the industry are sort of waking up to this. And it's transparency is sort of inevitable in our view.
So consumers love it.
Yes.
There's over 1,000 payment service providers in this country, some non-trivial portion of whom probably move money across borders. Depending on who you ask, you might hear our banking system is not so competitive, but there still are challenger banks that are vying for more and more market share. Given that consumers love this and there's no shortage of players vying for the customer, why hasn't competition sorted this out? Why are people still inflating markups so excessively?
So I think there's an awareness issue, like from the get go. So if you're a consumer and it's your first time sending money, for example, cross border, you might not actually realize that you hit that junk fee to begin with. It might only be on the second or third time that you're sending money that you realize, oh, actually, the exchange rates aren't matching up with what I see on Reuters or Google. So I think actually we get like reached out to by customers saying, why is this other player cheaper than you? But they're actually not. They actually just don't understand that there is a hidden margin there. And that's where this like misleading marketing of no fee or low fee is really harmful. Because, and we've seen like the US, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau crack down on this in March. If you are advertising zero or low fee, but you're actually hiding a cost in the exchange rate, that could be illegal. And so I think there's really like an awareness problem where you don't realize what you're paying until you've maybe done that transaction a few times. Um, but yeah, I think, and then the same with like small businesses, right? Like you might not wake up to that until it's a recurring payment or you've done it a few times. But I think there's a real awareness issue. And that just shows you how sort of pervasive the hidden or junk fee issue is in this space because consumers don't even realize that they're paying potentially up to 6% or more. They think they're actually getting that, 99 cents fee and that's it.
Are there any cases where consumers actually prefer the bundling of all these prices in such a way where the individual components are obscured to them for reasons of just simplicity? Like, I don't want to have to think about all these different
Right.
costs. I'd much rather just be given one price. I go ahead and pay it. It's fine.
So the UK government actually did some behavioral research like on cross-border pricing strategies. and they showed consumers who were sending money for the first time, like low, medium, or high transparency. When we talk about high transparency, we talk about the total cost. So this isn't a bunch of drop down fees that are very confusing. It's showing all currency conversion charges plus any fee in one single upfront amount that's very clear to the consumer that you could compare and contrast across providers. We saw that when they used the highest transparency level in that research, the number of consumers choosing the cheapest option doubled. So that I think speaks for itself. Now, are consumers only choosing a provider based on cost? Not always. Sometimes it's about speed. Sometimes it's about convenience. So I think the transparency in cost is really important, but I'm not claiming that that's the only factor, right, when a consumer is choosing a provider.
I can't help but think of one of the debates we're seeing um, unfold, or I should say, the debate we saw unfold at Indu during its credit card study. This big debate about IC plus pricing versus standard pricing for merchants. I do recall talking to a business that I frequent every now and again, and in light of this Indu stuff, I asked them, who processes your payments. They told me who. I asked them if they were comfortable with the pricing, and they said no. The pricing is too expensive. And I said, well, what do you pay? And they told me. I said, well, there are all these other providers who have a lower swipe fee, so to speak. Why don't you go with them? And their response to me was, well, with this particular provider, though the price is high, it's always the same. It doesn't change. And it's just
Certainty.
one price. I'm a very small business. I don't want to have to hire a payments team to look at my statements month after month and look at the variable charges and calculate each month what I'm paying in payment processing costs. I'd rather just know that I'm paying this percentage every month. Don't have to think about it. Set it and forget it. It works. Is there an analogous situation when it comes to cross-border money movement, or not quite?
I think there's a lot to be said for certainty, especially for a small business, right? They want to have a predictability, not only on the cost, but also for the quality of service, the speed, etc. Um, I think that there's a little bit of a misnomer, or maybe a misconception about cross-border payments that, and sometimes I think this is promoted by industry. It's impossible to know what exchange rates will be. It's impossible to give an estimation of fees. Well, in reality, I would maybe challenge that a little bit, because if you look at very um, popular routes in sort of mature markets, so like look at Canada to US, like are those fees in reality changing that much more than a certain difference day to day? Like, not really. So I think this idea that it's absolutely impossible to, you know, that consumers or businesses could expect a certain amount and be given that total amount up front, that's impossible from the financial service provider side, is just not true. And we know from our recent study that um, 96% of Canadians expect to see all the fees transparently before. So just from a consumer demand perspective, like we need to be meeting them where they are.
You'd mentioned some of the international work underway to address this. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So we have been really engaged in the G20, but also in the UN International Institution work streams on this. So like I mentioned, there's this UN Sustainable Development Goal. There's a similar goal from the G20 side, which Canada has committed to. There is a goal that by 2027, it's part of this sort of roadmap on cross border payments, that all providers should show fees transparently, including FX rate and currency conversion charges. And so, it's about to be 2025. So ideally, in 2 years, all Canadian providers would also be doing the same. What we see today is that, and we actually have another report that's sort of a scorecard looking at all the G20 countries and like where they rank in terms of fulfilling these targets, fulfilling these commitments. Right now, Canada is the second lowest out of the G7. So only behind, I think, Japan, compared to the US, the EU, and others in terms of achieving this transparency. And how we rate that is basically, there is existing regulation, the Consumer Financial Protection Framework, et cetera, but it's not specific enough, or it doesn't point to international payments, remittances, or FX markups in particular. And so as a result, Canadian consumers are not sort of seeing the benefits of transparency today. And so I think it's interesting to look at like what other jurisdictions have done and see where there might be progress made in Canada.
I want to ask you what can be done, but before I do, it's been a while since I, took a poli sci class, but I do recall vague lessons about cooperation between governments and these international fora, and I have this vague
Mhm.
recollection of arguments that just they're ineffective. It's hard to get people to take commitments seriously. A lot of these things aren't binding in any way, shape, or form. Is that one of the reasons why there are these commitments? But I mean, we're not really on track to meet them, and Canada is second last, if I heard you correctly, in the
Yeah.
G7.
Actually, I've seen a lot of willingness and drive from the Canadian government side and from Finance Canada in particular to and I should say, there are other targets that actually Canada is doing well on. So things like payments modernization. One of the other G20 targets was to expand access to the payment system beyond depository institutions. So that's happening now, right, with the amendments to the Canadian Payments Act and with this new retail payments regime coming in. So they're actually making a lot of progress in other areas. And I think there is a sort of a respect for multilateralism, which is super cool. But there's also a recognition that these things were not just ticking a box, it's actually making a difference for the people who use the payment systems, who use international payments in that country. And frankly, I think every country should be wanting to fulfill these targets because the reality is, if they don't do that, so let's say if Canada stays behind in the transparency space, it just means that Americans, Europeans are going to be benefiting from faster and cheaper cross-border payments compared to Canadians, and that's just too bad because I think it's a space that it's a pretty not easy fix, but a pretty nice win for consumers and businesses.
We're used to getting a poor deal from other sectors, so maybe we've just become a little complacent about it. Uh, w- if Canada has done a few things ahead of its peers, why does Canada still rank so low? What's Canada not doing that these other places are?
It's a good question. Um, I think it's just been you know, one of these things that's maybe been fallen between the cracks, frankly. Like, I don't think it's on purpose that it hasn't been addressed. But I do think the junk fees conversation like presents an opportunity to make more progress on this front. Um, there are several ways that they could do this. So for example, you could undertake behavioral research or market monitoring on like what is the current status of pricing strategies and transparency like by FCAC, but also it could look like the government enacting junk fees legislation, whether that's more broadly on financial services but also addresses this issue in particular. There's also the consumer financial protection framework, and I think that has brought more to the fore, like, the importance of disclosure, but again, just, like, hasn't maybe been specific enough, in order to sort of close these loopholes. We know that industry, in general, will do as much as they can to sort of, get around things, and so what we've seen in other jurisdictions is, like, if the rules are not I don't wanna even say prescriptive, but just not clear enough, um, providers will continue to hide fees where they can.
You said a few things there that struck me. The first being that this sort of fell through the cracks. I feel like a lot falls through the cracks here. The government's payments modernization initiative, though it has progressed over the more recent years, like this has been like a 10 to 15 year thing. And for the longest time, it had fallen through the cracks and no one was paying attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Despite all the big commitments, open banking, same kind of thing happened.
Right.
Before fall of last year, it really felt like the government wasn't going to do anything here and that it was just going to let the big banks and an entity, a few of them co-own, dictate what open banking looks like in Canada. A blank check, figure it out. The government announced a digitalization of money review to look at the risks posed by stablecoins and digital money. And then that just kind of, I mean, we haven't heard about it since. I think quite literally fell through the cracks. Why do so many financial sector initiatives that are so exciting to so many new players in the Canadian market fall through the cracks? There seems to be a pattern.
It's a good question. I think in the international payment space, this is I wouldn't say it's a new phenomenon, but when we see that the number of Canadians sending money cross-border has increased 33% year on year, the cohort of people who will be asking about this is getting larger, and it's affecting more and more Canadians. So I do think like this issue, just with recent immigration, but also like living in a more globalized and online world, comes to the fore a bit more, right? So that's the only thing that I could sort of think of. I think the status quo is really powerful as well. So until you bring awareness to something that's very broken and needs to be addressed, I see how that would just maybe not be a priority. I want to think that it's all well intentioned, but I think so that's why we're talking about this now, because we hear about it from consumers.
But when you think about cross-border payment fees, have they over time gone up, gone down, stayed the same? If we were to plot this out in a graph, a time series, what would it look like?
So I think overall the trend is going down, but it's not fast enough. So we released a remittance report a few years ago that looked at like how countries were meeting the goals, and most were off track, unfortunately. So overall, I think what we've seen is digital players coming into the space have helped drive fees down just through using technology and efficiencies through that. But I would also warn against that. That's not a silver bullet either. So just because firms are digital they tend to be cheaper, but that doesn't guarantee you that hidden fees are never going to happen. I think you see some of these efficiencies through technology, but in terms of the cost of these payments, like the FSB, I believe it was last year, had, or was it? Yeah, I think it was last year, had a graph that showed that foreign exchange costs are still a primary driver of the total cost of cross-border payments. So is the crux of the problem getting fixed? I'm not sure.
Right. One of the things you mentioned is that we need, this is the other thing that struck me about what you said a little earlier, junk fee legislation. As we said earlier in the call, the term junk fee comes with a lot of normative baggage. How worried are you that the term junk fees is more rhetorically useful than analytically useful, which may cause people with low standards of rigor and maybe even, low standards of virtue to apply the term too broadly to things that aren't actually junk fees?
That's certainly a risk, but I think no matter what you call it, if you're someone has sent money internationally, you know that hidden fees or junk fees or what have you exist in this space. And so I almost think, does the name even matter that much? If this is the theme of the day in terms of what the government is looking at, and that helps draw a magnifying glass over some of these problems, I think that's a positive thing. Um, to the point where can it be too broad brush and then sort of dilute the conversation? That's certainly a risk, but I think it doesn't take away from the fact that there is something happening in this space that's really harmful to consumers, whether that's a hidden fee or a junk fee. It's still happening.
Isn't there a cost, though, a real cost to consumers of being too all encompassing and including too broad a range of fees in what would be federal junk fee legislation if we could do that?
It depends what that looks like, I think. I think there's a general feeling from a lot, and this is, I would say, on both sides of the border, like between the US and Canada, being based here in DC. People are finding that everything is more expensive, that they're getting less than what they paid for, and that they're not seeing, being told clearly what the total cost is. And I think that is a real trend. So, yes, could it be too broad brush? Maybe there are areas that you're kind of, it's a reach, but I do think it's a trend. And what we see even is some trends to, like, where in the past you would have seen more fees up front, and we see some of those being brought and buried more than they were in the past.
Right. Do you, do you think this could be driven in part by um, consumers' inability to accurately estimate the cost of goods and services? There was this paper, I think it was published a few years ago. I have to hunt it down, but I think it basically looked at the price is right, and through sophisticated statistical
Sure.
techniques, found that people are systematically underestimating the prices of goods and services, and
Mm.
and the problem is getting worse and worse and worse as time goes on. Perhaps we're underestimating the effects of inflation or something like that. But is it possible that it's actually consumers' irrational behavior that's causing firms to adopt these strategies to counteract this bias that consumers have in the first place?
At least in the cross-border payment space, I don't think that's the case at all. I think consumers are misled based on promises that they've been given through marketing or other means that promises them a low fee, and there is a trust that the fee that you advertise will be what you pay, and I think that is, it's, uh it's normal that a consumer should expect that, you know, whether it's a financial service provider or another company, is being honest with them, right? And so I would actually flip that on its head. Like, consumers should be able to understand the total cost of a good or service in an easy way. It shouldn't require them getting out a calculator at the very minimum, right? Like, you can go to the grocery store, you can look at the same size of milk, and you can see which one is cheaper. When it comes to financial services, it's certainly not the case. And also, it requires you oftentimes, like, clicking on a terms and conditions document that's 30 pages long. Is it realistic for a consumer when they're shopping around for a financial service to have to do that? You could argue, yes, they should be doing their due diligence. But the reality is today is that everyone's shopping online, comparing and contrasting, especially with the likes of, like, hopefully open baking and things like this helping that. I don't think that consumers, it's not about low financial literacy. It's not about consumers not doing their due diligence. I think we need to raise the bar a little bit when it comes to being transparent with consumers, especially in financial services. And I think if you ask most people, like, you understand that there is a fee associated with something. You're not unwilling to pay a fee for a good or service, but there is also a trust between the consumer and the provider that, okay, you told me it's going to be $5.99 for my cross-border payment. It should actually cost that. And if that's not the case, you need to be presenting that information in a clear and understandable way.
I mean, look, that's not at all controversial. I think that's hard to argue with. But if we open it up to junk fee legislation, can't we imagine a world where, like, companies unlike Wise, maybe less virtuous than Wise, rushed the government to try to include some of the maybe legitimate fees their competitors charge um, as junk fees, so that they can use the law as a cudgel in their in their pursuit of profit. Don't we run the risk of that? And could we possibly be doing more harm than good in that world? Even if, and I mean, look, you've convinced me. Some cross-border payment fees are junk fees. Like maybe the solution lies somewhere else.
I think what the benefit that the junk fees conversation brings is more focus on this issue, and maybe in itself will sort of force industry behavior in a way. I mean, maybe that's a little bit naive, but um, if you're hearing from more and more people that this is not okay by them and they're going to switch providers because they totally lost trust in you because of these junk fees, maybe you're going to be thinking more, even without government intervention, about how you're presenting these advertisements or the fees. Maybe that helps. I do think that um, junk fees legislation could be helpful, especially in the financial services space, which is so highly like regulated, right? I think it's a little bit different maybe in other sectors, but in this space, like a lot can be done, and the government shouldn't, forget about how impactful some of these hidden fees are.
In some industries where people are a little more worried about public perception,
Mhm.
if consumers can't tell the difference between a legitimate fee and a junk fee, and again, say a legitimate fee is one charged on a subset of consumers who are being charged only to cover a cost that they're uniquely generating for the provider. Um, uh, don't we run the risk of these companies no longer charging that additional fee to these customers, and then forcing the consumers who aren't generating the cost to subsidize the consumers who are? So we're actually redistributing welfare from these consumers who don't generate the cost to the consumers who do. We're kind of you could think of it before where prices paid were reflective of costs generated. With something like this, where we're kind of undoing that, and people who don't generate the cost now have to pay for it. Like, what? Why is that fair?
I mean, I think it's up to every company or provider to figure out how they wanna do it in a way that's fair. Like, for example, at Wise, when you think about, like, what we're charging and how much a transfer costs, we're basically the more money you send, the more your transfer costs. So, um, that's how we see it as fair, to our customers. Um, the exception is where if you are sending a very small amount of money, and I think this is where you get to, like, you know, disproportionately affecting different groups, like, there should be a cheap minimum fee. So those people who are sending, for example, remittance payments, who can't afford to send a larger amount, at once, should be able to send a small amount and not sort of get penalized for that, right? So there's different ways of doing it, but I think that, the most important thing is that you're being transparent to the consumer about what they're paying.
Companies typically want the freedom to price their services how they want, and even communicate with their customers and how they want. But what you're advocating for is, I think, marginally less freedom in this regard. Why is Wise pushing for what, I mean, sounds like a pretty like pro-social change? Um, Advocacy and rent seeking and lobbying tend to be dirty words, in part because companies are perceived to be trying to pad their pockets at the expense of the consumer. But I mean, based on everything we've talked about, it seems like you're actually advocating for changes that protect the consumer. Why?
So, first of all, I'd say we're advocating for price transparency, not telling you how like what you should price or any limits on that. To each their own in that space, right? We were founded when two friends sent money cross border and realized that they lost out on a huge hidden exchange rate markup. And so, since 13 years ago, Wise has been building a way to move and manage money in a more transparent and cheaper way. And that's why we advocate for transparency. In a space where, 10 ish years ago, the status quo was telling consumers a very low fee and then upcharging them. Sometimes we see even 13 to 15% in a hidden exchange rate markup, we're saying there's a better way to do this, but it has to happen across the industry. It's not only about us, right? So it's about empowering the consumer to have more control over their own pocketbooks, and really fixing this market failure. So consumers don't really have the luxury today to sort of compare and contrast to find the cheapest option. We want policymakers to change that. And we also think it can be a win-win in terms of delivering transparency, but also improving choice for Canadians. It's kind of one of these things that I think, like I said before, is inevitable, but without a broader push on this, the status quo could remain. And consumers are making their voices heard on this, in Canada and beyond, in terms of this is not okay. I am a service member or a diplomat, and I get paid in Canadian dollars, but I need to spend the local currency where I'm based, and I'm getting ripped off all the time on these fees. So we are doing it because, one, it's what we are founded on, but we have also found that this really resonates with consumers around the world, that this is not okay.
Who else in the fintech space is asking for this?
I mean, I think there's, obviously fintechs and like-minded members, and I don't want to speak for others, obviously, in this call, but I think that there's a recognition, not only in the international payment space, but across, that transparency is the way to go, and this is how you win the market, right? Like, it's not by tricking people, it's actually by delighting them. And so I think you'd see, obviously our partners that we work with, like EQ, who's been such an amazing partner in Canada, but also others around the world that have, and even more traditional banks now, saying, actually, this does make sense for us. But most importantly, it goes back to their customers and what their customers are asking them for. So if they're saying, hey, I see other providers being more transparent, why aren't you doing it? Why is it so confusing to understand what I'm paying with you? That also puts pressure, right? So again, I think this is sort of like a global momentum that's only going in the way of transparency.
Is there anyone who opposes this, who would not like this?
I mean, I think the status quo is very strong and sticky, as you know. I won't name names.
Oh, I wanted you to name names.
No, I won't name names. I think it's just, there's always a sense of this is how things are done, and this is how we'll keep doing this. And that is the challenge, I think, of talking about this issue, where just because something's been done that way doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's what's keeping your customers happy. And actually, we're hearing the opposite when they are looking for other providers, right? So I think there's a recognition, governments around the world are seeing that this is a priority that needs to be tackled. The international community is aligned on this. We see new entrants and sort of fintech players talking about transparency and the changes that need to happen. So yeah, I think I would focus more on the positive, I hope, but maybe I'm naive.
To everyone listening, please check out Wise's report. We'll provide it in the links wherever you're accessing this. Brigit, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Alex.
And that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for joining us. If you're looking for more, visit us at fintechscanada.ca or follow us on LinkedIn. See you next time.